Welcome. Tonight we are going to talk about Manus's most daring missions. Let us journey together into the shadows of occupied Norway during the Second World War, where one man's courage and ingenuity would transform him into a legend of resistance against overwhelming odds. This is a story of daring raids, narrow escapes, and the indomitable human spirit that refused to be broken by tyranny. Picture, if you will, the Norway of 1940, a nation of dramatic fjords, snow-capped mountains, and proud people suddenly thrust into darkness. The German invasion had come swiftly, unexpectedly, shattering the peaceful neutrality that Norway had hoped to maintain. In those desperate days, as Nazi forces swept across the land, many Norwegians faced an impossible choice: to submit to occupation or to resist. Among those who chose resistance, few would become as legendary as Maximo Guillermo Manus, known to history simply as Max Manus. But before we delve into the daring missions that would make his name synonymous with Norwegian resistance, let us first understand the man himself. Max Manus was born on December 9, 1914 in Oslo, the son of a Norwegian mother and a Danish father. His childhood was unremarkable in many ways. He attended school, played with friends, and dreamed the dreams of ordinary youth. Yet within this seemingly average young man burned something extraordinary: a fierce love of freedom and an equally fierce hatred of injustice. As a young adult, Max had traveled to Spain during the Spanish Civil War, not as a soldier initially, but as a volunteer helping refugees escape the conflict. This experience exposed him to the brutal realities of fascism and left an indelible mark on his character. He witnessed firsthand what happened when totalitarian ideologies went unchecked, and this knowledge would later fuel his resistance activities with an intensity born of personal understanding. When Germany invaded Norway on April 9, 1940, Max Manus was 25 years old. The invasion shocked the nation. Norway had maintained neutrality during the Great War and hoped to do the same in this new conflict. But Hitler's strategic ambitions left no room for Norwegian neutrality. The country's long coastline, its access to the Atlantic, and its resources made it far too valuable to ignore. Within days, German forces had secured major cities and ports, and the Norwegian government was forced to flee. For Max Manus, the invasion was not merely a military occupation. It was a personal affront to everything he held dear. Norway was his home, his heritage, his identity. The sight of German soldiers marching through Oslo's streets, of swastika flags flying from Norwegian buildings, ignited in him a rage that could only be channeled into action. He would not submit. He would not collaborate. He would fight, even if that fight seemed hopeless. The early days of resistance were chaotic and disorganized. Norway had been utterly unprepared for invasion, and the speed of the German conquest left little time for organized military resistance. The Norwegian army had fought bravely, but was quickly overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. King Haakon VII and his government established a government in exile in London, but for those who remained in occupied Norway, the path forward was unclear. Max began his resistance work with propaganda. He and a small group of like-minded individuals started producing and distributing illegal newspapers and leaflets. These publications carried news from the outside world, information that the German-controlled press would never report, and they urged Norwegians not to lose hope, not to accept the occupation as permanent. The work was dangerous. Possession of such materials could result in arrest, interrogation, and imprisonment, but it was essential for maintaining Norwegian morale and national identity. Yet propaganda alone could not satisfy Max's desire to strike back at the occupiers. He wanted to do real damage, to hurt the German war machine, to prove that Norway would never truly be conquered. This desire would lead him into the shadowy world of sabotage, where small groups of determined individuals could inflict damage far beyond their numbers. It was during this period that Max Manus connected with the Oslo gang, also known as the Oswald Group, one of the earliest organized resistance cells in Norway. This group, named after its leader Reidar Holland, whose code name was Oswald, specialized in sabotage operations against German targets. They were amateurs in the beginning, ordinary Norwegians learning the deadly arts of explosives, weapons, and covert operations through trial and error, through captured German manuals, and through contacts with British intelligence. The British, recognizing the strategic value of Norwegian resistance, had established contact with various underground groups through the Special Operations Executive, the SOE. This secret organization, created by Winston Churchill with the directive to set Europe ablaze, provided training, weapons, and explosives to resistance movements across occupied Europe. For Norwegian saboteurs like Max Manus, the SOE connection was a lifeline, transforming them from angry amateurs into trained operatives. Max's first major operation came in the winter of 1941. The target was a German warehouse storing military supplies in Oslo. The plan was straightforward but required nerve. Infiltrate the warehouse, place explosives, set timers, and escape before the charges detonated. Max and his companions spent weeks preparing, studying the warehouse layout, timing guard patrols, planning escape routes, and rehearsing every step of the operation. The night of the operation was cold and dark, the kind of Norwegian winter night where the chill penetrates to the bone and the darkness seems absolute. Max and his team moved through the shadows, their hearts pounding, their senses heightened to every sound, every movement. They knew that discovery meant death or worse, torture by the Gestapo, betrayal of their comrades, the destruction of their entire resistance network. But fortune favored them that night. They reached the warehouse, bypassed the locks, skills they had painstakingly learned, and entered the building. Inside, stacked high, were crates of German military supplies, uniforms, boots, equipment, all destined for the Eastern Front, where German forces were locked in brutal combat with the Soviet Union. Max and his companions worked swiftly and silently, placing explosive charges at strategic points, connecting detonators, setting timers that would give them precious minutes to escape. Then came the most dangerous part, the withdrawal. They had to exit the warehouse, lock it behind them to avoid raising immediate suspicion, and reach a safe distance before the explosives detonated. Every second felt like an eternity. Every distant sound might be a German patrol. Every shadow might conceal an enemy soldier. But they moved with discipline learned through practice, trusting each other, trusting their planning, trusting their luck. They were several blocks away when the explosives detonated. The sound rolled across Oslo like thunder, echoing off buildings, causing windows to rattle and startled citizens to wake in confusion. Behind them, flames rose into the night sky as the warehouse and its contents burned. It was not a massive blow to the German war effort, one warehouse among thousands, but it was a statement. It said, "Norway is not defeated. Norway resists." And for Max Manus, it was proof that he could strike at the occupiers and survive. That first successful operation was intoxicating. The rush of adrenaline, the satisfaction of striking back, the knowledge that they had hurt the enemy, it was addictive. But Max was smart enough to know that success bred complacency, and complacency in resistance work meant death. After each operation, He and his comrades analyzed what had gone right and what had gone wrong. They studied German responses, learned from their mistakes, and constantly refined their techniques. As 1941 turned to 1942, Max became increasingly involved in more sophisticated operations. The Oslo gang had grown more professional, more capable, more dangerous to the Germans. They received better equipment from the SOE, including proper explosives, timing devices, and weapons. They also received training materials that helped them become more effective saboteurs. But with success came increased danger. The Germans were not passive victims of these attacks. The Gestapo, the feared German secret police, was actively hunting resistance members. They used informants, torture, and surveillance to track down saboteurs. The consequences of capture were horrific. Brutal interrogation designed to extract the names of other resistance members, followed by execution or shipment to concentration camps in Germany. Max knew the risks. He had seen comrades arrested, knew men who had disappeared into Gestapo cells never to emerge. Yet he continued his work, driven by a determination that bordered on obsession. For him, resistance was not merely about military strategy or political ideology. It was about maintaining his humanity, his dignity, his refusal to live as a slave in his own country. One of Max's most daring early missions involved sabotaging railway infrastructure. The Germans relied heavily on Norway's rail system to move troops and supplies, particularly to the northern regions where they maintained substantial forces watching the border with neutral Sweden and preparing defenses against potential Allied invasion. Disrupting these railways could have significant military impact. The target was a rail line outside Oslo that carried military traffic. Max and his team conducted reconnaissance for weeks, noting train schedules, identifying vulnerable points, and planning their attack. They decided to target a section of track that curved through a relatively isolated area, where they could work without immediate detection. The operation required precision. They would need to place explosives under the rails in such a way that the charge would detonate when a train passed over it, maximizing damage. This meant calculating weights, pressures, and timing mechanisms with careful accuracy. A premature detonation would alert the Germans and lead to increased security. A failed detonation would waste precious explosives and expose their position. On the chosen night, Max and two companions made their way to the target location. They carried their explosives carefully. Plastic explosives were stable but required respect. They also carried tools to dig beneath the rails and weapons in case they encountered German patrols. The work was physically demanding, digging in frozen ground while maintaining absolute silence and constant vigilance. They placed the charges carefully, using pressure-sensitive detonators that would trigger when the weight of a train passed overhead. Then they withdrew, covering their tracks, literally and figuratively, ensuring that no evidence of their presence remained. They had to move quickly but carefully, knowing that dawn would bring German inspectors and the element of surprise would be lost. The next morning, as Max and his companions listened anxiously to reports, the news came. A German military transport had been derailed. The explosion had torn up the track, sending several cars off the rails. The damage was significant. Soldiers injured, supplies destroyed, and most importantly, the rail line closed for repairs. It was another successful strike, another blow against the occupation. But success had consequences. The Germans responded with fury, implementing stricter security measures, increasing patrols, and intensifying their hunt for resistance members. The Gestapo increased their use of informants and intensified their interrogation of suspects. The net was tightening, and Max knew that his time in Norway was running out. In early 1943, the situation became critical. The Gestapo had arrested several members of the Oslo gang, and under torture, some had revealed information about other members. Max's name was on a list, and it was only a matter of time before they came for him. The resistance leadership made a difficult decision. Max and several other key operatives would have to escape to Sweden, regroup, and receive proper training from British intelligence before returning to Norway. The escape to Sweden was itself an operation of considerable danger. The border was heavily patrolled by German forces, and the journey required crossing miles of difficult terrain in winter conditions. Max and his companions were guided by experienced smugglers who knew the mountain passes and secret routes. They traveled by night, hiding during the day, always alert for German patrols or collaborators who might betray them for reward money. The crossing took several days of grueling travel through snow and ice. They endured freezing temperatures, hunger, and the constant fear of capture. At one point, they had to hide for hours in a snowdrift as a German patrol passed within meters of their position. But eventually, exhausted and half-frozen, they crossed into Sweden and safety. Sweden, though officially neutral, quietly supported the Norwegian resistance. Swedish authorities looked the other way as resistance members used their country as a transit point, and Swedish citizens often helped Norwegian refugees. From Sweden, Max and his companions made their way to Stockholm, where British intelligence had established contact points for resistance operatives. The journey from Stockholm to Britain was complex, involving multiple forms of transport and careful coordination with British intelligence. Max eventually found himself in Scotland, at one of the SOE's training facilities, where he would receive professional instruction in the arts of sabotage, demolitions, weapons handling, and covert operations. The training was intensive and demanding. Max learned about different types of explosives, how to construct timing devices, how to identify vulnerable points in infrastructure, and how to conduct reconnaissance without detection. He learned about security protocols, how to detect surveillance, how to recognize and evade interrogation techniques. He also learned about weapons, pistols, submachine guns, rifles, and received training in hand-to-hand combat. But more than technical skills, the SOE training instilled discipline and professionalism. Max had always been brave and determined, but the training transformed him into something more. A trained saboteur, capable of planning and executing complex operations with military precision. He learned to think strategically, to assess risks and benefits, to make cold calculations about danger and opportunity. During his time in Britain, Max also connected with the Norwegian government in exile and Norwegian military units being organized in Scotland. These connections would prove crucial for his future operations. He met other Norwegian resistance fighters, shared experiences, learned from their successes and failures, and built a network of contacts that would support his later missions. In late 1943, Max Manus was ready to return to Norway. His mission was clear. He would lead sabotage operations against German shipping in Norwegian harbors. This was a strategic priority for British intelligence. German ships using Norwegian ports were transporting critical war materials, iron ore from Sweden, troops and supplies for the occupation forces, equipment for the Atlantic Wall defenses. Sinking these ships would directly impact Germany's war effort and tie down German forces in Norway that might otherwise be deployed elsewhere. The return to Norway was made by boat, a dangerous journey across the North Sea in winter conditions. Max and his team traveled in a small fishing vessel, timing their crossing to avoid German patrols and navigating through minefields that the Germans had laid to protect Norwegian waters. The crossing took several days, and they endured rough seas, bitter cold, and the constant danger of detection. They landed secretly on the Norwegian coast, where local resistance members were waiting to receive them. From there, they made their way to Oslo, moving carefully, using safe houses and trusted contacts, gradually rebuilding their network and preparing for operations. The Oslo they returned to was different from the one they had left. The German occupation had grown harsher. More collaborators worked openly with the Germans. The Gestapo presence was stronger. Norwegians lived under constant surveillance and threat. But the resistance had also grown. More people were involved in underground activities, from distribution of illegal newspapers to harboring refugees to active sabotage. The spirit of resistance, far from being crushed, had strengthened. Max's primary target was German shipping in Oslo harbor. The harbor was a major transit point for German military traffic, and ships docked there regularly to load and unload cargo. But attacking ships presented unique challenges. Ships were well guarded, harbors were patrolled, and the ships themselves were designed to resist damage. Simply placing a bomb on a ship's hull might not be sufficient to sink it. Max and his team studied the problem carefully. They needed specialized equipment, limpet mines, magnetic explosive devices that could be attached to a ship's hull below the waterline. These devices, supplied by the SOE, were designed specifically for attacking ships. They were waterproof, equipped with magnetic clamps to attach to steel hulls, and used time delay fuses that allowed the saboteur to escape before detonation. But using limpet mines required getting close to the target ships, often requiring swimming in freezing water or using small boats to approach undetected. This was dangerous work, requiring not only courage but also physical stamina and swimming ability. Max and his team practiced in secluded locations, learning how to approach silently, attach the mines, and withdraw without detection. Their first major ship attack came in early 1944. The target was a German cargo vessel docked in Oslo harbor, reportedly carrying supplies for German forces. Max and one companion waited until late at night, when harbor activity was minimal and visibility was poor. They had studied guard routines and identified a window of opportunity when they could approach the ship undetected. Wearing dark clothing and carrying the limpet mines in waterproof bags, they made their way to the harbor. The water was icy, painful even through their clothing, but they pushed through the discomfort. They swam silently, barely disturbing the surface, approaching the ship from the side away from the dock where sentries were posted. Reaching the ship's hull, Max carefully removed a limpet mine from its bag. The device was heavy, and attaching it required strength and precision. He had to dive beneath the surface, position the mine against the hull, and activate the magnetic clamps, all while holding his breath and fighting the cold that numbed his fingers. After what seemed like an eternity, the mine was in place, attached firmly to the hull, its timer set. They attached 2 more mines along the ship's length, then withdrew as silently as they had come. Swimming back to shore, they were both shaking from cold and adrenaline, but they maintained discipline, taking separate routes to their safe house to avoid being tracked if one of them was spotted. Several hours later, the mines detonated. The explosions tore holes in the ship's hull below the waterline, and water poured into the vessel. The ship began listing, and despite German efforts to save it, it eventually settled to the bottom of the harbor, blocking part of the dock and creating chaos in the German logistics operation. This successful attack was followed by others. Max and his team became specialists in attacking German shipping, developing techniques and refining their methods with each operation. They targeted cargo vessels, transport ships, and even small warships. Each successful attack not only damaged German logistics, but also boosted Norwegian morale and demonstrated that the resistance remained active and dangerous. One of Max's most famous operations came in April 1944, targeting the German ship Donau. The Donau was a large transport vessel being used to carry German troops and supplies along the Norwegian coast. It was well defended and considered a valuable asset by the German military. Sinking it would be a major blow. Max spent weeks planning the operation, gathering intelligence about the ship's schedule, its cargo, its security arrangements, and the harbor conditions. He identified the optimal time for the attack, when the ship would be docked and fully loaded, maximizing the damage and disruption. The operation required a larger team than previous attacks. Max assembled a group of trusted operatives, each with specific roles. Some would create diversions to draw attention away from the harbor. Others would provide security, watching for German patrols. And Max himself, along with his most experienced swimmers, would place the limpet mines. The night of the operation was dark and moonless, providing cover but also making navigation difficult. Max and his team moved into position, each person knowing their role, each prepared for what might go wrong. The tension was almost unbearable as they waited for the signal to begin. When the moment came, Max and two companions entered the water. The cold was shocking, but they pushed forward, swimming toward the Donau's massive silhouette. The ship loomed above them, its hull a wall of steel that seemed impenetrable. But they knew where to strike. Below the waterline, where the explosives would breach the hull and flood the compartments. Working quickly but methodically, they attached 6 limpet mines along the ship's length. Each mine was placed with care, its timer set, its magnets firmly attached. The work took longer than planned. The cold slowed their movements, and at one point they heard voices above them and had to freeze, motionless in the water, until the danger passed. Finally, the mines were in place. They withdrew, swimming away from the ship, their muscles cramping from cold and exertion. They reached the shore, changed into dry clothes cached earlier, and melted into the night, making their way to different safe houses to avoid capture if anyone had witnessed their presence. The explosions came at dawn. The sound rolled across Oslo, announcing to the city that the resistance had struck again. The Donau lurched as water poured through the breaches in its hull. German sailors scrambled to respond, but the damage was too severe. Within hours, the ship had capsized and sunk, taking with it a significant cargo of military supplies and blocking the harbor for days while salvage operations were conducted. The Germans were furious. They launched a massive manhunt, conducting raids across Oslo, arresting suspects and intensifying their efforts to crush the resistance. But Max and his team had disappeared into the underground network, moving between safe houses, changing their routines, always staying one step ahead of the Gestapo. The sinking of the Donau was a major propaganda victory for the Norwegian resistance and a boost to Allied morale. News of the operation was broadcast by BBC Radio to occupied Europe, inspiring other resistance movements and reminding everyone that the fight against Nazi Germany continued in countless ways across the continent. But Max knew that success made him a marked man. The Gestapo had put a price on his head, and collaborators were searching for information about his whereabouts. Every day in occupied Oslo was a day of danger, and every operation increased the risk of capture. Yet he continued his work, driven by the same fierce determination that had motivated him from the beginning. In the following months, Max conducted several more operations against German shipping. Each attack followed the same pattern: careful planning, reconnaissance, precise execution, and immediate withdrawal. Each successful operation demonstrated the vulnerability of German logistics and the impossibility of completely securing Norway against determined resistance. One particularly audacious operation involved attacking a ship while it was in the middle of loading operations during daylight hours. This required extraordinary boldness, as harbor activity was high and the risk of detection was significant. But Max identified a window of opportunity when guards were changing shifts and attention was divided. He and his team managed to approach the ship, attach limpet mines, and withdraw before anyone noticed their presence. Hours later, when the mines detonated, the ship was fully loaded, and the resulting damage and loss was devastating for the Germans. As 1944 progressed and the tide of war turned increasingly against Germany, Max's operations took on even greater strategic importance. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 had opened a new front in Western Europe, and German forces were being stretched thin. Every ship sunk in Norwegian waters, every rail line sabotaged, every warehouse destroyed meant resources that couldn't be used elsewhere. The Norwegian resistance, and Max Manus in particular, were contributing to the broader Allied effort in meaningful ways. But the cost was high. Several of Max's comrades were captured during this period. Some were executed immediately, others died under torture, still others were sent to concentration camps. Max himself had several close calls, narrowly avoiding Gestapo raids, changing safe houses minutes before German police arrived, living with the constant knowledge that any moment might be his last as a free man. The psychological toll of this existence was enormous. Max lived under constant stress, never able to truly relax, always alert for danger, always aware that betrayal might come from unexpected quarters. He suffered from nightmares, flashbacks to operations that had gone wrong, memories of comrades who had been captured. Yet he continued, driven by a sense of duty and purpose that overrode his own fears and doubts. One of Max's most challenging operations came late in 1944, targeting a heavily defended German supply depot. The depot contained ammunition and fuel for German forces in the region, and destroying it would significantly impact German operational capability. But the depot was a fortress, surrounded by fences, guard towers, and constant patrols. Max spent months planning the operation, studying the depot from every angle, mapping guard routines, identifying weak points, and calculating the precise amount of explosives needed to destroy the facility. The plan was complex, requiring simultaneous attacks on multiple points to create confusion and prevent German forces from responding effectively. The operation was launched on a winter night when heavy snow reduced visibility and muffled sounds. Max led one team targeting the main ammunition bunker, while two other teams attacked secondary targets, fuel storage tanks and vehicle depots. The teams moved with military precision, cutting through fences, neutralizing guards silently, and placing their explosive charges. But then something went wrong. An alarm sounded, perhaps triggered by a motion sensor they had missed, perhaps raised by a guard they hadn't accounted for. Suddenly, searchlights swept the compound, and German soldiers poured from the barracks, weapons ready. Max and his team had seconds to make a decision: abort and try to escape, or complete the mission and fight their way out. Max made the choice instantly. They would complete the mission. They had come too far, risked too much, to turn back now. He shouted orders to his team, directing them to finish placing charges while he and one companion provided covering fire. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. Max and his companion engaged the German soldiers with submachine guns, creating enough confusion and suppression to allow the demolition team to complete their work. Bullets cracked past them, ricocheting off metal surfaces, and Max felt the hot breath of near misses. But training and determination kept him focused, kept him returning fire, kept him covering his comrades. Finally, the call came. Charges placed, timers set. The team began its withdrawal, fighting their way toward their planned escape route. Max was the last to leave, providing covering fire as his comrades withdrew. A German bullet grazed his shoulder, a burning sensation followed by the warm wetness of blood. But he ignored the pain, focused on getting his team to safety. They made it through the fence and into the darkness beyond as the first explosions detonated behind them. The ammunition bunker erupted in a massive explosion that lit up the night sky, followed by secondary explosions as stored ammunition cooked off. The fuel tanks ignited, sending towers of flame hundreds of feet into the air. The supply depot, painstakingly built and stocked by the Germans, was being consumed by fire. Max and his team dispersed, each taking a different route to their safe houses, knowing that German forces would flood the area searching for them. Max's shoulder wound was painful but not serious. The bullet had merely creased the flesh. A resistance doctor treated it in a safe house, cleaning and bandaging the wound, providing antibiotics to prevent infection. The destruction of the supply depot was a major blow to German operations in the region. It also demonstrated that despite increased security measures, despite the Gestapo's best efforts, the resistance could still strike at high-value targets. The operation became legendary in Norwegian resistance circles, a testament to courage, skill, and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. As 1945 began, it was clear that Germany was losing the war. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, Allied forces from the west and south. The Third Reich was being crushed between these advancing armies, and its defeat was only a matter of time. But for Max Manus and his fellow resistance fighters, the end of the war could not come soon enough. Every day of continued occupation meant more arrests, more executions, more suffering for the Norwegian people. Max continued his operations with undiminished intensity. He knew that these final months might be the most dangerous. Desperate German forces might lash out with increased brutality, and collaborators might become more active, hoping to secure German favor before liberation came. But he also knew that each successful operation hastened the day of liberation and saved Allied lives by tying down German forces and disrupting their logistics. One of his final major operations was attacking a German naval vessel in Oslo harbor. The ship was a mine layer, used to maintain the defensive minefields that protected Norwegian waters from Allied naval incursions. Sinking it would not only remove a military asset, but also potentially disrupt the entire minefield network, as the Germans would lose the detailed maps and coordinates that the ship maintained. The operation followed the familiar pattern: reconnaissance, planning, preparation, and execution. By this point, Max and his team had refined their techniques to an almost surgical precision. They knew exactly how to approach ships, where to place charges for maximum effect, and how to withdraw without detection. The operation went flawlessly. The limpet mines were placed, the team withdrew, and hours later the explosions tore through the mine layer's hull. The ship sank rapidly, taking its mine maps and equipment to the bottom of the harbor. It was another successful strike, another demonstration of resistance capability, another small victory in the long struggle for freedom. But even as Max celebrated this success, he received news that chilled him. The Gestapo had captured one of his closest collaborators, a man who knew details about resistance operations, safe houses, and personnel. The man was tough and loyal, but everyone had their breaking point under torture. Max knew that he had to assume the worst, that under interrogation, his comrade might reveal information that would lead to arrests, including potentially Max himself. The resistance leadership made a difficult decision. Max and several other key operatives would have to cease operations temporarily and go into deep hiding, moving to remote areas where the Gestapo's reach was limited. It was frustrating. With the war obviously nearing its end, Max wanted to continue striking at the Germans, to contribute to the final push for liberation. But security had to be the priority. Max went into hiding in the Norwegian countryside, staying with sympathetic farmers who provided shelter and asked no questions. These were long, frustrating weeks. He listened to BBC broadcasts on hidden radios, following the progress of the war, hearing about Allied victories, about the collapse of German defenses, about the liberation of concentration camps, and the full revelation of Nazi atrocities. He longed to be back in action, to be part of the final triumph, but he had to trust that his comrades would continue the work. The end, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The news spread across Norway with lightning speed, carried by illegal radios, whispered in streets, shouted in joy. The occupation was over. After 5 long years of darkness, Norway was free again. Max emerged from hiding to scenes of jubilation. Norwegian flags, illegal during the occupation, suddenly appeared everywhere. People danced in the streets, embraced strangers, wept with relief and joy. German soldiers, uncertain and afraid, surrendered their weapons. Collaborators, knowing what awaited them, tried to flee or hide. For Max Manus, liberation was bittersweet. He was overjoyed to see Norway free again, to see the German forces defeated and departing. But he also thought of all those who hadn't survived to see this day. Comrades killed in operations, captured and executed by the Gestapo, sent to concentration camps from which they never returned. The cost of resistance had been high, paid in blood and sacrifice by men and women whose names would never be widely known, but whose courage had contributed to this moment of victory. In the days and weeks following liberation, Max was recognized as one of Norway's greatest war heroes. He had conducted numerous sabotage operations, destroyed significant German military assets, inspired countless others to resist, and survived when so many had not. The Norwegian government in exile, returning to Oslo, awarded him military decorations. The British government, recognizing his work with SOE and his contribution to the Allied war effort, also honored him. He received the Distinguished Service Order, the Military Cross with bar, and the War Cross with 2 swords, among the highest military honors Norway could bestow. But for Max, the real reward was simply being alive in a free Norway. He had never sought glory or recognition. He had fought because occupation was intolerable, because freedom was worth any sacrifice, because remaining passive would have been a betrayal of everything he believed in. Yet the war had left deep scars. Max struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. He had nightmares about operations that had gone wrong, about comrades who had been captured, about the moments when death had seemed certain. He had trouble adjusting to civilian life, to a world where he didn't have to constantly look over his shoulder, where he could walk the streets without fear of arrest. The memories were always present. The cold water of Oslo harbor as he swam toward enemy ships, the weight of explosives in his hands, the sound of German gunfire, the faces of friends who hadn't survived. These memories would never truly fade, would never stop haunting him in quiet moments. The price of heroism, he learned, was not just paid during the war, but continued long after peace had been restored. Max tried to build a normal life. He married, started a family, worked in various civilian occupations. But the adjustment was difficult. How could one return to ordinary concerns after years of living on the edge, of making life and death decisions, of existing in a world where courage and cunning were the currencies of survival? He found some solace in telling his story, in ensuring that the sacrifices of the resistance would not be forgotten. He wrote about his experiences, gave lectures, spoke to young people about the importance of defending freedom. His accounts were not boastful or self-aggrandizing. They were matter-of-fact descriptions of what needed to be done and how he and others had done it. He emphasized that resistance was not about individual heroism, but about collective determination, about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when their principles were threatened. The story of Max Manus became an important part of Norwegian national identity. His missions represented something fundamental about the Norwegian character: a refusal to accept tyranny, a determination to fight for freedom regardless of the odds, a courage that transcended fear. For a small nation that had been invaded and occupied, these qualities were sources of pride and inspiration. Yet Max himself remained modest about his accomplishments. When asked about his wartime actions, he typically deflected credit to others, emphasizing that he had been part of a larger movement, that many had risked and sacrificed as much or more than he had. He particularly honored those who hadn't survived, insisting that the true heroes were those who had given their lives for Norway's freedom. As the years passed and the war faded into history, Max Manus became a living link to that desperate time. Younger generations, born in freedom, heard his stories with fascination and sometimes incomprehension. How could Norway have been occupied? How could ordinary citizens have fought against a military superpower? How did people find the courage to risk everything for abstract principles like freedom and national dignity? Max's answers were always the same. When fundamental values are threatened, people must choose whether to resist or submit. Resistance was dangerous, often seemed hopeless, and required sacrifices that many were unwilling to make. But submission meant accepting a world where might made right, where bullies went unchallenged, where people became complicit in evil through their passivity. For Max, resistance had been the only acceptable choice, regardless of the personal cost. Looking back on Max Manus's most daring missions, we see not just tales of explosives and ships sunk, but a deeper story about human courage and moral choice. Each operation he conducted required not only technical skill and physical bravery, but also a profound commitment to principles that transcended personal safety. In the cold waters of Oslo harbor, attaching limpet mines to enemy ships, he was not merely damaging German logistics. He was asserting that some things are worth dying for, that freedom is not a luxury, but a necessity of human dignity. The Donau operation stands out as perhaps his most famous achievement, but every mission told the same story: that determination and ingenuity can overcome overwhelming odds, that small groups of committed individuals can make a difference against vastly superior forces, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. Consider the complexity of these operations. Max couldn't simply plant explosives randomly and hope for the best. Each mission required detailed intelligence gathering, careful planning, precise execution, and calm nerves under extreme pressure. He had to learn about explosives and detonators, ship construction and vulnerable points, harbor security and patrol patterns. He had to develop skills in covert movement, swimming in freezing water, working in darkness, and maintaining absolute silence while performing complex tasks. And he had to do all this while knowing that capture meant torture and death, that a single mistake could doom not only himself, but his entire team. The psychological dimensions of Max's resistance work are equally remarkable. To live for years under constant threat, knowing that at any moment the Gestapo might arrest you, that collaborators might betray you, that friends and comrades were being captured and killed. This required a mental fortitude that few possess. Max had to compartmentalize fear, suppress natural human instincts for safety and comfort, and maintain operational effectiveness despite stress and trauma that would break most people. Yet he also had to retain his humanity. Resistance fighters like Max weren't mindless warriors or propaganda caricatures. They were complex human beings with fears, doubts, and emotional needs. Max felt grief when comrades died, experienced terror during close calls, and struggled with the moral weight of his actions. Sabotage operations, while necessary, sometimes resulted in casualties. Not just German soldiers, but also Norwegian workers who might be near targets when explosives detonated. These moral ambiguities created psychological burdens that Max carried long after the war ended. The post-war challenges Max faced remind us that heroism has costs that extend far beyond the immediate danger of wartime operations. The transition from resistance fighter to ordinary citizen proved as difficult as any mission he had conducted. The skills that had kept him alive during the war, hypervigilance, suspicion, quick violence, were liabilities in peacetime. The intense purpose and clarity of wartime resistance gave way to the more ambiguous challenges of ordinary life. Many resistance fighters, not just Max, struggled with depression, alcoholism, and difficulty forming relationships. The price of their courage was paid not just during the war, but for decades afterward. Yet Max's story is ultimately one of hope and inspiration. Despite the trauma, despite the costs, he believed his actions had been worthwhile. Norway was free, Nazi Germany had been defeated, and the values he had fought for, human dignity, national sovereignty, resistance to tyranny, had prevailed. His sacrifices, and those of countless others like him, had contributed to a better world. The legacy of Max Manus extends beyond his individual accomplishments. He became a symbol of Norwegian resistance, an embodiment of national character, a reminder that small nations can defend their freedom through courage and determination. His story inspired subsequent generations, not just in Norway, but around the world, demonstrating that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when driven by principle and determination. His missions against German shipping demonstrated strategic thinking beyond mere destructive impulse. By targeting logistics and transportation, he struck at vulnerabilities in the German occupation apparatus. Each ship sunk, each depot destroyed, each rail line sabotaged, represented not just immediate damage but cumulative degradation of German capability. Over time, these small acts of sabotage added up to significant military impact, forcing the Germans to divert resources to security, to slow their operations, to question their ability to hold Norway securely. This strategic dimension of resistance is often overlooked in favor of more dramatic narratives of battlefield heroism. But Max's approach, patient, calculated, focused on maximum impact with minimal resources, demonstrated sophisticated military thinking. He understood that resistance wasn't about matching German military might directly, which would be impossible, but about exploiting vulnerabilities, creating uncertainty and imposing costs that accumulated over time. The relationship between Max and the broader Norwegian resistance movement is also instructive. He wasn't a lone wolf operating in isolation. He was part of networks, supported by safe houses, supplied by couriers, protected by countless ordinary Norwegians who harbored resistance fighters, passed messages, and maintained silence under German interrogation. His individual courage was amplified by collective commitment, by a society that, despite occupation and collaboration by some, retained a core opposition to German rule. This social dimension of resistance reminds us that historical events are not just about individual heroes, but about collective action and social movements. Max could not have conducted his operations without support networks, without people willing to hide him, feed him, provide intelligence, and maintain silence about his activities. Every successful operation was the product of dozens or hundreds of people making small decisions to support resistance at personal risk. The moral clarity of Max's resistance, fighting against Nazi occupation, can sometimes obscure the complexity of resistance ethics more generally. In Max's case, the enemy was unambiguously evil, a regime that had invaded Norway without provocation, that was committing genocide across Europe, that represented everything opposed to human freedom and dignity. Resistance against such an enemy raised no serious moral questions. But Max's story also reminds us that resistance always involves difficult choices. Should resistance fighters risk civilian casualties to strike military targets? Should they prioritize spectacular attacks that boost morale but might provoke German reprisals against innocent civilians? Should they cooperate with communist resistance groups despite ideological differences? Max and his comrades grappled with these questions constantly, making decisions that weighed military effectiveness against moral considerations. The personal dimensions of Max's story, his relationships, his emotional life, his inner world, are less documented than his operational achievements, but equally important for understanding the human reality of resistance. Max was not a Superman without fear or doubt. He was a man who chose courage despite fear, who continued fighting despite doubts, who maintained commitment despite the psychological costs. His struggles with post-war adjustment testify to the very real human costs of resistance, costs that continued long after the shooting stopped. In remembering Max Manus and his most daring missions, we honor not just one man's courage, but the broader principle that freedom must sometimes be defended through personal sacrifice. His story teaches that tyranny need not be accepted as inevitable, that resistance is always possible, that courage can be found when needed. These lessons remain relevant in any era, in any context where people face the choice between complicity and resistance. As we conclude this story, picture Max Manus in his later years, an older man carrying memories of desperate times, of comrades lost, of dangers survived. Picture him speaking to young Norwegians about the war, about resistance, about the importance of defending freedom. His words carry weight because they come from lived experience, from someone who faced the ultimate test and passed it, who risked everything for principles he believed in. The cold waters of Oslo harbor where he swam toward enemy ships, the darkened streets where he moved between safe houses, the moments of terror when German bullets cracked past him. These memories never faded. But neither did the memories of liberation, of seeing Norway free again, of knowing that his sacrifices had contributed to something larger than himself. Max Manus's most daring missions were not just military operations, but affirmations of human dignity and freedom. In the darkness of occupation, He and others like him kept alive the light of resistance, the refusal to accept tyranny, the determination that Norway would be free again. Their courage inspires us still, reminding us that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when driven by principle and determination. Tonight, as you reflect on this story, let it remind you that history is not just made by armies and governments, but by individuals who choose courage over comfort, who act on principle despite danger, who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. Max Manus's legacy is not just the ships he sank or the depots he destroyed, but the example he set. That one person, determined and brave, can make a difference even against overwhelming odds. May his story bring you peace as you contemplate it, and may you rest well knowing that people like Max Manus existed, that they fought for freedom, and that their sacrifices created the better world we inhabit today. Good night. And remember always the cost of freedom and the courage of those who defended it.